Okay, so tried to record this video yesterday, but got briefly distracted. So here we are. I have curry fried rice. Basically, I have no idea how to make, hold on, that's worse. Basically, I have no idea how to make fried rice, but I just do rice, veggies, and then I do like seasonings or stuff, and this just happens to be a whole bunch of seasonings in the primary seasoning is curry. So anyway, my hands are dry. What am I doing? Anyway, today we're going to be talking about the Dyatlov Pass Incident. This does not look cooked enough. So between February 1st and 2nd of 1959, 9 Russian hikers went missing in the Ural Mountains. That's this story. And this is the story of their journey and their end. So, also, all their names, everything in this, like every name, is Russian. I'm uncultured, and I cannot pronounce Russian names. So, just give me the benefit of the doubt, and we will proceed. Igor Dyatlov, who is like the face of the event, he was 23 years old, and he like led the team of, originally it was 10 hikers, including him, and we'll get into that later. And he was an engineering student where he met the other 9 hikers. The group consisted originally of 8 men and 2 women. All were pretty good hikers with pretty decent experience. And the whole point is that they were going to the Gora or Toten Mountains. When they returned, they would be certified as grade 3 hikers, which is the highest certification for hikers in the Soviet Union / Russia. I don't know at what point it's called Russia now. I don't know if it's also called the Soviet Union or if it was called the Soviet Union and then now it's Russia, and that's 2 different time periods. I have no idea. I'm uncultured, like we said before. Igor was always regarded as being a very good leader. He was very intelligent, reliable. He also was very athletic because he hiked so much. He got calf muscles. I'm gonna read the names of the next members because I can't remember them all. So, Yuri Doroshenko, who was 21. Lyudmila Dubinina, who was 20. She was one of the females. Georgy Krivonyshenko, who was 23. Alexander Kolvator, who was 24. Zineda Kolmogorova, who was 22. That was the other female. Rustam Slobodin, who was 23. Nikolai Thibault Brinols was 23. And Semyon Zolotaryov, who was 38. And Yuri Yudin, who was 21. In 1959, the year my dad was born, on my birthday. Isn't that weird? January 23rd? Anyway, January 23rd, 1959 is whenever the group was like, here we go, we're going. It took them a little bit to get there. It was kind of like a journey in and of itself just to get to the mountain, let alone hike the darn thing. And the Gora or Toten mountain was very difficult to climb at this time. They were shooting for an early to mid February hike. And basically that was whenever it was deemed really difficult to hike. I don't know if that was the point. Maybe it had to be at that time to be difficult to get the grade 3 certification. I don't know. It just seems weird that we're going to go at the most difficult time in the world. The group arrived in Ivdel by train on January 25th of 1959. They then took a truck to Vizhai, and that was the last known settlement that they visited before they embarked on their trip up the mountain. And it was in Vizhai that they bought loaves of bread for the trip. I don't know what existed in 1959, but I feel like I would be stacking on a whole bunch of protein bars and just surviving off of that. Because I ain't eating a whole loaf of bread, people. On January 27th is when they left Vizhai and they officially started their trip towards Gora or Toten. And on January 28th, Yuri Yudin, who was the 21-year-old, he was basically having a lot of health issues with the altitude, and also he had pre-existing health conditions, and he had a knee injury, and all of those things combined made him unable to continue the hike, so he ended up leaving at that point. And when he left, Igor basically was just like, we're gonna send a telegram back to Vizhai on February 12th, but I think it's going to take longer than that, so maybe a little bit later. Yuri Yudin was like, cool, and I think he went back to Vizhai to wait for them. I have no idea how hiking works, but it says on January 31st was when they prepared to start climbing, so I don't know if they got to the base of the mountain and then they had to start climbing up the mountain. I also don't know how steep it was, because when I think of climbing a mountain, I think of straight up like the movies, but also I know you can hike a mountain and it's somewhat could be like this, and you could just walk up it. So on the way to the mountain, they were scavenging food for the trip back down the mountain. And I think they were doing this by just berries and fruits and veggies and leaves and twigs. I don't know what you eat. I'd be too afraid to eat a berry that I would be poisoned and die. And on February 1st is when they officially began the climbing. So during this time, there was a really bad snowstorm. And so during their climb, they got thrown off of their route and they went a bit too far west to Kholat Syakhl, and basically once they realized that they had been gotten so far off, they decided to make camp there on the slope of the mountain, which it's not like a smart thing to do to make a campsite on a slope of a mountain, especially like in a snowstorm. But Yuri Yudin said that it was probably because Igor didn't want to lose progress they had made, or he wanted to get more practice with making campsites on slopes. But police thought it was kind of weird that they didn't go back down the mountain and make shelter in the wooded area that would protect them from the snow. And the area for their campsite is now named the Dyatlov Pass after Igor Dyatlov. I think I'm saying that right. First of all, Russian names are very pretty. I just wish I could pronounce them. On February 20th, there was no telegram to be received yet, and so all the families asked for a rescue operation because the police hadn't done anything at this point. And the first rescue troops were volunteer students and teachers from their school. On February 26, Michael Sherevin, who was one of the volunteer students, actually found the campsite on Kholat Syakhl, and he recalled that the tent looked torn down and covered in snow. Which, it's been a couple of weeks, so I don't know why that's the snow part suspicious, but apparently it was. So all of their belongings were actually still inside of the tent, and it had been concluded that they had cut their way out of the tent, and that it was cut from the inside to get out of the tent and not vice versa. Also around the tent, there were 9 sets of footprints. And also about the footprints, no one was wearing 2 shoes. They were always wearing 1 shoe, socks, or they were just barefoot, which I thought was weird. How can you tell that from snow track prints? I guess toes. And after 500 meters away from the campsite, the footprints were covered in snow. So at the edge of the wooded area at the bottom, where the mountain and the wooded area meet, there was a fire, and this was where the other Yuri and Georgie's bodies were found. So the 2 bodies were only in their underwear, they were barefoot, and there was a tree nearby, and all the branches were broken off of the tree 5 feet up, so the police thought that someone had tried to climb it to get a better view of the surrounding area. Igor, Rustam, and Zenaida their bodies were also found between that fire pit and the campsite. The police thought that they were actually trying to return to the camp. It took about 2 months, so on May 4th, they had actually found the other 4 hikers, and they were found 75 meters further into the woods. 3 of the 4 members that were found were better dressed, so the police thought that the other 5 members had died, and then these 4 had scavenged their clothing. So for instance, Lyudmila was wearing Georgie's pants, which had been torn and burned. A lot of stuff mentioned that clothes and bodies were burned. I couldn't figure out whose bodies were burned and where. I just know that some of them were. So the medical examiner concluded that Igor, Yuri, Georgie, Alexander, Zenaida, and Rustam had all died of hypothermia. And the other, 3? Yeah, the other 3 had died from other complications. So Lyudmila she died of internal bleeding from a chest trauma, something hit her in the chest trauma. She was also missing her tongue, her eyes, parts of her lips, parts of her facial tissue, and she had a fractured skull. Nikolai had died of a fatal skull injury. Semyon had actually died from chest trauma, and he was also missing his eyeballs, which was weird. Also to note, which was kind of weird, Alexander, who they concluded had died of hypothermia, he was actually missing his eyebrows. So I don't know. Just strange. The forensic expert, his last name was Vozrozdeny, and he believed that all of this damage had happened after the people had died because of the location of their bodies. I don't really know how he concluded that, but I'm not a forensic expert. There was a theory about the Mansi people, who were the natives of that land. They're very territorial and that they may have actually attacked them. Basically, they were reindeer herders and they inhabited the area. One of the substantial evidences against them was that there was only 9 footprints walking away. But also, it was concluded that all of the trauma that had happened towards their bodies, they were too great that a person couldn't have did it. They were more synonymous with a car crash. This was also supported by the evidence that there was no wounds on their actual body, no open wounds, so all of their injuries were pressure and force. It was very confusing because the police concluded that a compelling natural force had attacked the group. They had died 6 to 8 hours after their last meal, and there wasn't anything that made it seem like they were rushing away from the campsite, because it seemed that the footprints were not in a rushing manner. They were walking at a normal pace, and I would assume that they would know this by how deep they were in the snow, because if you're running, you're Pew! And if you're just walking, you're Pew! On one of the person's bodies, it didn't say who, but high amounts of radiation were found in their clothes. Also, there was no information about the internal organs of the hikers, so we have no idea if anything happened to them. So from February to March of 1959, the police had actually gotten a lot of witness testimonies that there were strange orange floating spheres in the sky. And this happened the night of the Dyatlov Pass incident as well. It happened over the course of 2 months, but specifically it happened on that night. And at the time, the police didn't connect these two events at all. In May of 1959, the police stopped looking for a guilty party just because there was no evidence that any sort of person or people were involved in this. It was strictly just the hikers, so they stopped the inquest from happening. In 1997, all the negatives from Igor's camera had been archived, and they were actually submitted to a secret archive, and nobody has ever seen these negatives. And so if you don't know, basically old cameras had negatives, so basically it was like a foundational copy of whatever photos you took. So you would take a picture, it would have the negatives, you'd go get the negatives printed, and they would print all the photos, but you'd still have the negatives, so if you wanted to, you can go get more copies printed. In 1990, Lev Ivanov was the lead investigator of the case, and he had said in 1990 that the police had also witnessed the floating orbs, but that they were told to dismiss these claims from that case. In 1999, there was a Dyatlov Foundation that supported the Dyatlov Museum to keep the investigation open, to build awareness, and to have the funds. I dropped my little safety pin. Oh no. Found it. No, I didn't. Ew. In 2013, Yuri Yudin, he's noted as being the only surviving member. That's not fair because he didn't really go. You know what I mean? He quit 2 days in. So I don't, sorry. That's my opinion. Anyway, in July of 2016, a memorial plaque was actually dedicated to him as the sole survivor. Again, I don't agree with this, but it's fine. Found it. On April 12th of 2018, Semyon's remains were exhumed on suspicion. There was a couple of things. Basically, where he was buried, his name was not marked where he was buried. And that was kind of suspicious. They did his DNA. There was no living relatives from his DNA. And that's kind of suspicious. Just to remind you, Semyon was the oldest one. He was 38 years old. They did a 3D reconstruction of his face, and it was similar to the ones in the photos. But basically, police had been suspicious of him because they thought that someone maybe had been hiding underneath his name, and so they were trying to get more information about him. In February of 2019, Russian authorities did reopen the case under the assumptions that it was either an avalanche, a snow slab avalanche, or a hurricane. They have completely disputed the idea that it was a crime, and they are strictly looking into the compelling natural force that they talked about. But actually, over 75 theories have been theorized for this case. An avalanche is the primary theory, and they basically thought that an avalanche was happening, and then the group basically left the tent to escape the avalanche, and then they went to the woods, and then they died as a result of the avalanche. The 4 people who got a whole bunch of pressure trauma were hit directly by the avalanche, and the other ones were just buried in the snow, and they died of hypothermia. And to contradict this theory, there was no signs of an avalanche. There was no debris anywhere. The people that were covered under snow were covered under a thin blanket of it. And also, if 4 members got hit by it, why didn't they all get hit by it? And that was, yeah, suspicious. Also to note was that the tree line was not damaged, which it would have been by an avalanche, and a physics study was actually done, and it was actually determined that an avalanche was not possible at the time. Igor and Semyon, so Igor was the leader and Semyon was the 38-year-old, they were very experienced hikers, and they would not have made a campsite in a potential avalanche zone. And also, all of the footprints were, why is it not feet print? Anyway, they were all walking at a normal pace. None of them were alluding to them being in any hurry. So if there was an avalanche coming, you're not just going to walk away. You're going to be running. You're going to be sprinting like you'd never sprinted before. In 2015, it was reported that at the time of this event, the weather was really bad. The temperatures were below, they were negative 40 degrees Celsius, which is very cold. And that the winds were hurricane speeds. They basically theorized that the first 5 members died of hypothermia, and then the remaining 4 had fallen into a snow hole, and then that's how they got the trauma from falling. In 2019, a research group went to the site, and they basically thought about the idea of a katabatic wind, which is basically wind going from high pressure in a mountain to low pressure below the mountain. It is really fast, and it's really harsh winds. And so they basically thought that the group had left the tent, covered it with snow, left a torch on the tent so they could find it later, and went back down the mountain. And that the group had split into 2 groups, and the 2 groups had made shelters, and one of them collapsed on the 4 that had pressure trauma. Which doesn't really explain why those 4 were wearing the most clothes. Donnie Eicher theorized the idea of infrasound, and basically it's this idea that a certain frequency will trigger panic in people, and basically basically it was thought that the wind speed had made this frequency, and they had panicked, left the mountain, went back to the woods, and they were able to regain their consciousness, but then the 5 died of hypothermia there, and then 4 had fallen over a ravine and landed on rocks, and that was the pressure. There was another theory about military experiments. In this evidence for this theory, there was noted that in photographs of the tent was actually erected incorrectly, which would be very, like, Igor and Semyon and like these other experienced hikers would know how to set up a tent, so they didn't understand why it was set up incorrectly, but I don't really know how that relates to this military experiment theory. Anyway, the orange orbs were thought to be parachute mines that the Russian army were testing at the time, and basically they thought that they heard the mines, panicked, got out of the tent, and then went down to the woods, and then that's where the 5 died of hypothermia, and then the 4 remaining ones died of the parachute mines, which would be synonymous with their pressure blows being much more than a person could do to them, and a mine blowing in your face, yeah. And then like it also could explain why maybe their eyeballs and tongue were missing, but they were also never found, so I have no idea. One of the theories was radiation, and radiation had caused all of this, and some of the evidence was the radiation found on one of the people's clothing, and also that the skin of some of the people were turning orange and the hair was turning gray. But radiation was only found on one person's clothing, it wasn't found on all of them, and also they had thought that the orange skin and gray hair was just the mummification process happening because it was so cold and they were starting to mummify. There was also suspicion that this was a cover-up because some of the files were left out and some of them were secret, but in 1980 all the files were released. And so in Russia at the time, it wasn't uncommon to leave certain like domestic issues is what they called them, out of files, that they would just overlook them or not document them because they were seemed like minimal, and that was common at the time. That doesn't really say much, but also like it works in their favor to be like, we don't record domestic issues, and it's like the cause of these hikers' deaths was a domestic issue that we don't wish to go over, allegedly, reportedly. There was an idea that this was an animal attack, but there were no animal tracks, so maybe the Mansi people threw them down the mountain. Wow, Matthew, pressure. Mansi people, the indigenous people, the native people, they would have known to cover their tracks as they were leaving, so that's why their tracks were not found, because they're smart cookies. Then they threw them down the mountain. A Yeti attack was proposed by the Discovery Channel in 2014, but there was no evidence. That was just them needing viewers at the time. Anyway, this has been the Dyatlov Pass Incident. This has been Cooking Up Crime. I think we're on episode 7 now. My name is Hugh Ramus, and if you want to see a case, let me know. Just so you know, it might be a couple weeks until I get to it, because I have like the next 4 cases already written. I have the scripts written, and so I just need to record them, edit them, and then upload them for those weeks. Anyway, it's been great having you here while I ate my food, and you listen to this case. So, hope you have a great day, and good luck to you.
I want you to forget your past lives and find me the new Christ. I want your heart to melt like ice in the midst of July.